How you write a research paper and how you write a good paper are kind of different.
That's two very different things.
A research paper tells a story.
I like talks and papers that have a clear message.
What's the most significant bit?
What's the main point?
Put yourself in the shoes of the reader.
Be nice to the reader.
You want to be their friend
in a way that will be the easiest for the reader to understand.
Introductions are extremely important.
Find the right abstraction.
Getting advice from more people.
Get advice from your advisor.
Ask for your collaborator for their help.
This is part of our research. This is part of our work.
It's not easy for anyone.
A good paper has clearly laid out theorem statements. The theorem statements should not be ambiguous. It should be clear what are the underlying assumptions, what is being achieved, right, and so on. There should also be like a justification as to why the problem statement is interesting. There should be a good overview explaining the ideas behind the approach, and also very well organized technical sections. If you're just starting out writing a research paper, then the best thing to do is get advice from your advisor or senior graduate students or anyone who has enough experience in your research area. Should prepare yourself to spend a lot of time writing papers. It's a skill that that takes a lot of time to develop. Don't expect your first draft to be good, and prepare yourself to polish your draft multiple times. Another suggestion is to read many well-written papers and to try to figure out the thought process that goes behind writing these papers.
Oh, well, that's two very different things. So yeah, how do I write papers? Like, not the right way to write a paper. I typically write a paper. I mean, I think that this is very endemic probably to a lot of us. I don't know if endemic is the right word, but like, yeah, I think a lot of us, maybe you're better, but somehow because of our culture, like there's this culture of writing a paper basically a week before the deadline. Like, I don't know, maybe you have some like technical stuff sort of written before then, but like the paper really gets written in a week. Maybe a week is even too generous, like maybe 2 days, a day before the deadline. This is typically how I write papers. I do not think it's the way to write a good paper. It's not. It's definitely not. So like then typically after the deadline, I'll spend a lot of time cleaning up the paper, hopefully. Yeah, so I think part of this, the reason, so I don't want to knock writing like this entirely, because somehow the deadline makes it possible to like get everyone on your project. I mean, we work very collaboratively. I think if you're not as collaborative, it's like less of an issue. If you're writing like single author, like, yeah, you can write whatever you want. But if you're working collaboratively, like, right, the only really way to get people to clear their calendars for a significant amount, like for a couple of days, like really write the paper together, is to have a deadline. Otherwise, like no one's going to actually commit to the time. They're going to schedule meetings in the middle, and like, they have all this other stuff going on. So this is good in some sense, but I also think it's like, right, you rush, you're stressed, you I don't know, this is not necessarily the best way to write a paper. It tends to create these, flow of consciousness expositions that are not necessarily, you don't always think about the best way of presenting things, I think, pedagogically maybe, so that other people can learn. It can work, yeah. I just don't think it's the right way. I think it creates a lot of stress and you end up, and I think it also creates a culture of like, rather than writing something as clearly and concisely as possible, you tend to use sort of cheap tricks to get your ideas across, like sort of dramatizing the motivations behind the paper and stuff like this. And this, I think, is ultimately, wasting people's time and perhaps even in some cases putting bad ideas into people's heads, where mistakenly thinking that something is promising more than it is. Well, yeah, you can't write a systems paper in this fashion, right? You can't run all your tests like 2 minutes after the deadline it's already ended. The server is still open. So yeah, but yeah, exactly. I think like if you can write a theory paper well, you don't need to sort of resort to, it's important to motivate what you're talking about, of course. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that, but I think that rather than having sort of like these grandiose, somewhat ridiculous motivations, you can, if it's well written, then it's sort of aesthetically, it stands on its own more effectively.
For me, these two questions are very closely related, because the core of communicating what I have done and what I care about to other people is to extract the conceptual core. What's the main point? Why do I care? Why do I care? Why do I care? Why did I spend all this time on this project? So starting from why do I care, I can then communicate what the gist of the paper or what the gist of the research is about. I think that once I've written down or planned a talk starting from my perspective, why do I care, what I do then as a second step is that I look around and see what do other people care about, what is their perspective on similar things, why might they think that this is important, and I kind of see how to integrate this into the paper, and sometimes, or to some extent, also into a talk. In a talk, the time is much more limited, so often you need to cut much more branches, things that you could speak about. But in the paper, there's a little bit more space to put pointers and references, and to embed your own ideas into the bigger field. Personally, I find it very nice to read papers that are written in this way, because I want to feel and hear and know, why does the person who writes this paper care about this research? Why does the person who gives the talk care about this? This is what I want to hear. That's what I enjoy hearing. When someone instead gives a talk or writes a paper, trying to make it completely impersonal and saying, okay, so this is why other people might care about this research, then I find this very hard to listen to and care about, because it might be that the perspectives that are cited are not mine and are not even the perspective of the person who did the research. So then it's very disappointing. So for me, it's really everything has to start from why do I care about this, and then to extract the gist out of this. And
in my opinion, a research paper tells a story. Before writing a paper or even working on a problem, it can help if one visualizes the story. Some questions to ask are: what is the problem? Why must the world or community care about it? What is the aspect of the problem that makes it hard? What have others done to solve it, and why do those approaches not suffice? How are you going to solve this problem? If we do not have a good answer to any of these questions, we might have to even reformulate the question. While we may not always be in a position to do this, a great aim is to try and have a first draft of the paper ready a few weeks before the deadline, and then spend those weeks in writing and editing the paper. This can lead to a very well-written paper.
So in some sense, writing a good paper, it requires some rewrite and edit, and ask for your collaborator for their help. And you will write a good paper in the end?
I mean, that's a very difficult question again to give just one answer to. I would say a couple of things at least, namely that one thing is that one of the most important things to me is that you have to explain the idea or the ideas in a way that comes across easily. It can be, of course, that your paper is technically complicated and there might be some proofs that are really difficult, and that's fine. I mean, if it must be, it must be. But there is always an idea behind why do we do it this way? Why is the proof structured this way? And that I think is very important to get across. You shouldn't be afraid of simplifying things a bit for that purpose, because you'll do things probably technically afterwards. So why not jump a few fences to make sure that you get the idea across. I think that's the single most important thing. A general thought that is also important, I think, which is actually really, really hard, is to put yourself in the shoes of the reader, which is sometimes one of the reasons it's very hard is because you tend, when you write, to tell a story in the way you thought of it, which is sometimes dangerous, because often we get to the goal via a very convoluted route. First we tried this, that didn't work, then we tried something else that didn't work either, and so finally we arrive at the actual idea. And then if you try to tell all that story, you might just confuse the reader. So it can be a good idea to rewind and what is this really about if you take away all those detours we had to take.
So when it gets to how to write papers and how to structure talks, I mean, typically I do that sort of in reverse order, or in some sense, I really first write the most technical things. I'm in papers trying to get down the most technically challenging lemmata or whatnot, because if you're sort of already working, say, on an introduction or a technical outline, and later you should discover that something doesn't quite work out, this is work that has to be redone. So I try as much as somehow possible to really get the technical, the technical things solid first, get the main body, and then, I mean, try to get some inspiration to write an introduction and technical outline, why I even worked on this in the first place, and how you can see on an intuitive level how this comes together. I mean, this is sort of a very natural or a very popular paper structure that we have right now. Like if you go back 20 years, we don't have these exuberant technical outlines. But today, it seems reviewers need to review so many papers, have so little time. You want to be their friend. You want to present your results to them in a way that's best accessible for them, showing them that you appreciate their time, right? That you try to come halfway towards them. And yeah, I think that's, I mean, when I'm a reviewer, I'm always happy if I get a very detailed technical outline that tries to pick me up halfway.
Right. So I like talks and papers that have a clear message, where if you could tell me the result statement in, say, like a simple sentence that this is what we have accomplished, I think those are like the best papers, because it's also an indication that the problem is interesting, because if you can state the problem and the result of your paper in a single sentence, that means that the problem can be easily described. Maybe people have already heard about the topics you're talking about, and it's likely to be of broader interest.
So I think. So maybe what is, in my opinion, a good research paper, I think it should be approachable and ideally, of course, fun to read, because you want people to read it, you want people to follow up on it. And I think it's very crucial to find the right abstraction. So write the paper in a way that the reader is not confused by details because it's too specific, but of course also not find an abstraction that is kind of so far away from what's happening that is also not helpful. So try to really write it in a way that the inherent ideas become clear. I find it personally very helpful to zoom out and, for example, work on the introduction and then go back to writing the technical part, or even give a talk, because in a talk, even more than an introduction, you are forced to zoom out and you're forced to find the right abstraction. So this is something I found very helpful, and I think like the first try, no matter if for a paper or for a talk, is never kind of the right way, and it's always good to keep thinking about it and keep improving.
A research paper has 3 different parts. Each is very different: the introduction, the technical overview, and the technical body. So for technical body, what I like to do is to start with fixing the definition section as well as the structure of the paper, which includes all the section structure as well as all the main theorems and the lemmas that should be proven. And I find that having a good definition section and the structure of the paper is absolutely important, because it really forces you to think about the entire paper as a whole, to decide what are the key concepts and notions that you want to put forward, to decide how you're going to structure the paper and how to best feature your ideas in different theorem and lemmas, as opposed to having it buried inside very lengthy security proof. It also fixes notations throughout to be consistent. And so once you have these parts done, then filling in the rest of the details becomes, in some sense, a lot easier. So I often say that having the definition, the structure of the paper is almost half amount of the work. Once I'm done with the technical part, I'll come to write the technical overview. And the technical overview, really, we wanted it to be a very engaging story that features your main technical contribution. So what I usually do is I first sit down and try to distill what are the most important ideas and what these ideas are for, overcoming what challenges. And once I figure out what are those challenges and ideas, then I try to come up with a coherent story that sort of features these challenges and ideas one by one and telling them like in a story. Figuring out what are the main ideas is actually not quite easy, and it really requires having a very, very clear view about what's a contribution, and also organizing your thoughts in different layers and separating the purpose different ideas serve. So you want to have kind of a tree-like structure, knowing that what's a top level idea, and then finding down what are the lower level challenges towards kind of making the idea work, and then what are the lower level ideas for each of the specific challenges. And having a story, then have a story that kind of introduces these different pieces one by one instead of jambling all the different ideas together. Okay, so when finally it comes to the introduction, writing the introduction is an art, and it takes a lot of experience and practice. It just comes with time. And again here, I think the most important thing to do is to first figure out what's the most significant bit. What's the take-home message that you want the reader to take away after reading the introduction? And these most significant bits and the most important ideas needs to be succinct enough, high level enough, but they're the absolute most important part. So start with those things and trying to write down the take-home message for both the results as well as the techniques. Then structure the rest of the introduction from the backgrounds, introducing the landscape, and then leading to the question you're trying to address. all of these things come serving conveying the most significant bits. You want to have the most significant bits appearing as early as possible, and then having the rest of the paper sort of touching on the most significant bits from different perspectives multiple times to reinforce the message.
So first of all, it's important to know how to write these papers, because I remember one of my first papers were rejected many times because I didn't know how to write it well. Okay, you also need to know like the language, and it's very important to have somebody and ask from somebody to give you comments on your manuscript. And then getting advice from more people slowly, you can learn how to write the paper in our language.
That's a good question, and that's a skill that comes with time, I think. Learning how to write a good paper. Having a good and convincing technical result is definitely a very important part. But once you have this, you need to find a way to present it in a convincing manner. You need to be able to write the technical contributions in terms of theorems and proofs in a technically correct and sound way. But you also need to think about how to present them in a way that will be the easiest for the reader to understand. And this goes to things like being able to define different levels of abstraction and being able to talk about your results at different depth, including something that you put in the introduction, which explains at a very high level your results and how they fit in terms of what is known, what they are solving, what are the open questions. And this should be ideally accessible to a broader audience than somebody who is a technical expert in your field. And when we go down to the technical part of the paper, you should really look at papers that you found easy to understand and follow. And in the beginning, even try to emulate what you found compelling or what you found intuitive in their presentation, which goes, of course, to the way you're explaining proofs and constructions and et cetera, but it's even in terms of how do you arrange your text on the page and how do you make sure that one can read and understand what's the goal of every equation, of every scheme or construction. You should try to make it as clean and as organized as possible.
I think the most important thing in writing papers and in preparing lectures is to understand that this is not something we do in addition to our research. This is part of our research. This is part of our work. Research is the work of a community. And part of the research is communicating by papers, communicating by a talk. If you don't invest, so my point is that you need to come to it with motivation and understand that a lot of the impact of your work depends on how you write it and how you present it. And then I think that things fall into place. Once you view it as an important thing, then you do a good job with it. I had cases in the past where people knew, read a single paper that I wrote, but they enjoyed it, and that's the entire impression of me. So even from a very calculated perspective, writing a good paper, giving a good talk, that's what people will know about you. They don't count, okay, you wrote 5 papers or 6 papers in your PhD. That doesn't matter as much as doing the ones well. So understanding the importance and spending the time is extremely important, and it's very beneficial as well.
So I have some advice that I always like to give to my students. And the advice is when writing a technical paper, I think it's a really good idea to kind of imagine that there's a line. There's a line in the middle of your LaTeX file, okay? And everything above the line is something that you feel completely confident about. You know, you've written every detail, the proof works precisely, and every line falls from the previous line, right? And then below the line is intuition. It's stuff where you say, well, I think these things are true, maybe some conjectures, some lemma statements and things like that, right? And to me, actually, both of these things are incredibly important, right? Because you want to first develop an intuitive way of explaining what's going on, right? Which is kind of below the line. And then you want to move that line down, right? As you move things from things that you understand intuitively to things that you can actually formally establish, right? So I see sort of the process of writing a paper is first the line is at the very top, and you only have intuition below, and you keep adding intuition. And you keep that around, of course, right? Because it'll be useful in the introduction or in the technical overview. And then the process of writing that paper is bringing that line down, you know, taking everything, making it formal, putting it above the line, and sort of making it all the Lego pieces fit together, right? I think that's what makes a good paper, right? A good paper has both intuition, the overall structure should be clear, as well as, of course, it should be sound and carefully written and carefully established. All students should realize that it's difficult work. You know, it's not easy. It's not easy for anyone, right? It is, especially, for example, just a definition, right? All of the work that goes into, or really should go into, just pinning down a well quantified, meaningful, and achievable definition in cryptography is just really important, right? And highly non-trivial, and it's so easy to make mistakes there. So all of that kind of detail work is actually really, really important. And I hope that all students, you know, who maybe are listening to this, would grow in their appreciation for how nice it feels when you finally get it to work. You know, that there's that kind of feeling that's an analog to like when your program finally compiles and runs, you know, like there's just that feeling like I finally got all the pieces together, right? And I think that having that excitement that you know that like that's what you're aiming for will help to keep you motivated, right? To like why work through all those details, especially in some areas of cryptography, can be really heavy, right?
So there's a few lessons that I learned during my PhD where my supervisor actually told me a few things, and I think those were really helpful. One was be nice to the reader, right? We actually recognize this when reading papers, that sometimes there's something pretty like a really theoretical concept or something really, you know, deep to understand. And then before introducing this, for example, giving a nice small example of it so that you get a bit of an intuition before actually diving into the full formalism. This is often so helpful when reading a paper. And so keeping that in mind when writing a paper or writing a thesis, for that matter, right, where you don't have page limits, so you can actually do this. This really helps. For a title, what I try to do is, on the one hand, keep it short. So I like one-line titles. On the other hand, I'm imagining somebody in 5 years searching for related work to something, and then maybe the 2 or 3 keywords that they're entering in Google, at least one of them should be maybe in my title. So what I feel is the most relevant, so that people have a chance of finding this paper. Then another lesson that I was taught by my supervisor was I write papers in a skippable way. So there's some people who read a paper for very specific reasons. Some people only want to get one single number out of a paper, like the performance, the cycle count on this very specific microarchitecture, for example. They should be able to find this number quickly so that they can put it in their related work session, cite it properly, and that is it. Some people are interested in techniques, and they should find this very quickly and give people a chance to read only the parts of the paper that are really at that moment relevant to them. And part of that is, well, advertise in the abstract why people should read your paper. That's one thing. But also make clear why people maybe shouldn't read your paper. So if you can save people some time when they read the abstract and notice that that's actually not a solution to what I'm looking for, it's also really useful.
Write a research paper and how you write a good paper are kind of different, and kind of depends on what you mean by good, I suppose. How do I write a paper? I do the research and I type it up as I go along in LaTeX, and I try and get all my students to do the same thing, because you remember things, you don't forget. If you do some work, if you typed up in LaTeX, then you might think, oh, this is irrelevant now, but 6 months down the line, it could be relevant. So you kind of still got it there, and you can move stuff around, and you can see your thought process. Whereas if it's all on bits of paper everywhere, it's just a mess on your desk, and no one else can see it. So it's kind of dumb. How do you write a good paper? I think that's very subjective. Obviously, all my papers are good. Just referee 2 never agrees with me. So yeah. So I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question.
I try to give some results. Try to explain what the results are early on, as early on as possible, and try to be careful about setting out the structure of the introduction. You know what I want to explain in what order before I get to writing it. I think the other thing is that I tend to write something, and you know, once I have some structure in mind, I'll try to follow it, and then often I realize that it's not right at all, and then I'm flexible about changing my mind and rewriting it. So yeah, I think that happens a lot. You start out with an idea and then you implement it, and you realize, oh no, that's actually not the way I should have done it. Yeah, I think the introductions are extremely important. People have a really limited amount of time to understand these papers. You know, this paper will be on ePrint. It'll be one of the, whatever number you mentioned, 1,600 papers. People will be scanning, and I want them to try to get something out of it in a short amount of time. So I always think about, like, if they just read this part, or if they stop here, can they actually, will they get something out of it? So, and I think maybe more than, you know, if you think about how much time it takes to understand a paper, the length is not the length of the paper, the length of the intro is not the right measure. Sometimes you have very complicated ideas that if someone really try to go through a proof, follow it carefully, it will take them many hours. But if you write a very nice short description in the introduction, it could take them 10 minutes and shave off a lot of time. So, so yeah, I think it's important to be conscious of it, that your work is going to be part of this incredibly large body of other works, and you want to make it as accessible to people as possible in the limited time that